Welcome to the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Max Chalmers, a tobacco researcher at Georgia State University. TOPS is organized by Catherine McLean from George Mason University, C. Shong from The Ohio State University, Mike Pesco at Georgia State University, and Justin White from the University of California, San Francisco. The seminar will be 1 hour with questions from the moderator and discussant. The audience may pose questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from these questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable comments. Please keep the comments professional and related to the research being discussed. Comments that meet the seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they are not read aloud. Your comments are very much appreciated. This presentation is being video recorded and will be made available along with the presentation slides on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will turn the presentation over to today's moderator, C. Shong from The Ohio State University, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Today, we continue our spring 2023 season with a single paper presentation by Bukola Usidame entitled The Effectiveness of the 2012 Canadian Graphic Warning Label Policy Change. This presentation was selected via a competitive review process by submission through the TOPS website. Dr. Bukola Usidame is an assistant professor of public health at Purdue University, West Lafayette campus. Dr. Usidame's research interests include examining the impact of policies on tobacco-related outcomes. Some of her current work includes assessment of retail policies on tobacco product use and differences across race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status in the state of California. Dr. Usidame's background spans public health, public administration, and public policy. She has examined impact of national and global policies, such as point-of-sale bans in Canada, graphic warning labels on cigarette packages in Canada, and smoke-free policies in Nigeria on tobacco-related outcomes, including health disparities. Some of Dr. Usidame's past and present lectures include interdisciplinary research methods with a focus on African Americans and introduction to public health. Dr. Usidame graduated with a bachelor's degree in physiology from the University of Port Harcourt, Nigeria. She earned her MPA from Clark University, Worcester, Massachusetts, and her MPP and PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston in 2018. Our discussion today is Justin White from University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Usidame, thank you for presenting for us today.
Thank you, C, for that wonderful introduction. I will just start by sharing my screen. All right. So can I get a confirmation that everyone can see you can see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. All right, I'll start by thanking everyone for joining this presentation. As C had mentioned, my name is Bukola Usidame. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University, and today the title of my topic is Examining the Effectiveness of the 2012 Canadian Graphic Warning Label Policy Change by Sex, Education, and Income. So we had a three-way interaction, difference in difference technique for this study, which is why I'm presenting that today. All right. Before I go into the study itself, I'd like to declare that two of our co-authors had served as expert witnesses for governments defending their country's tobacco policies. And one of them also served as a paid expert consultant to the Ministry of Health of Singapore in reviewing the evidence on plain or standardized cigarette packaging. So all other authors have no conflicts of interest. And this study was funded by a grant from the National Cancer Institute. So I'm going to start with the background. In the year 2000, Canada became the first country to include colored graphic warning labels on their cigarette packages. And that was because before then, there were several countries that had graphic warning labels on their cigarette packages, but they were not colored, so it was black and white. So we're the first people to include the colored graphic warning labels. Now, evidence shows that at that time, a little bit about the warning labels, there were about 16 different designs that they introduced, and all cigarette packages were to have one of those designs, either any one of those designs. And you're to put them to cover 50% of the cigarette packages. In addition to that, they inserted text messages in the cigarette packages with some quick messages and just tips on how to stop smoking. And then studies came out after that showing that there was the policy was really effective. It led to lower smoking prevalence. There was an increased knowledge of health information and just stronger cognitive and behavioral responses to the label warnings itself. And people started to think more about quitting and about the risks of smoking. But somewhere around 2009, we decided to notice a decline in the effectiveness of the warning labels, and especially as related to the impact of the label in people remembering that they saw the label and how that impacted how they thought about smoking. So in 2011, they replaced those regulations with stronger requirements, and one of them is the one that's shown on this slide. So now the labels were to cover 75% of the cigarette packages. And another thing they did was, instead of putting text messages inside the cigarette packages to advise people to quit, they put pictorial messages inside the cigarette packages. And the final thing was that they added a quit line number on the cigarette packages. So there were a series of interventions that took place, but these were all stronger requirements, and they now had a stronger policy in place. And even after the 2012, there were a few observational studies that showed that it was working, and studies had existed that showed that strengthening your label requirements was linked to positive outcomes, tobacco-related outcomes. But the other thing that was missing was that we had very few quasi-experimental studies that actually focused on the effect of that policy using a control group. And in terms of understanding how that impact was different across socio-demographic groups, evidence was mixed. So we had people saying it was stronger among female versus male, some male versus female. And but overall, regardless of how mixed it was, there was an agreement that it was beneficial across sex and socioeconomic status. So what we wanted to do was to actually do a quasi-experimental study that focused on the effect of that policy. So using a control country that did not have that kind of policy in place, and then also use that same method to see how that actually impacted people across sex and across socioeconomic groups. So in order to do that, we had to get access to pre-policy data from Canada and post-policy data from Canada. And we chose the United States as our control country because it's the country that was most similar to Canada in terms of population characteristics and several things. And the other thing is, the United States has only a text warning label on its cigarette packages. So we're able to see the differences in that policy using United States as a country. So before we did the study, we had our hypothesis, which was that the 2012 Canadian change will be associated with higher values for the label impact index and greater quit intentions, which I will elaborate on when I talk about my measures. But we're going to see stronger responses among individuals from lower SES groups when compared to those same population groups in the United States that had only text, that had text-only warnings. So for this study, we used the International Tobacco Control 4-country survey. The survey started in 2002. Up until, it's still ongoing, but at 2006, they switched it to the International Tobacco Control 4-country smoking and vaping survey because they now had questions about e-cigarettes. So we used all the waves from 2002 on to 2020. And several studies have used the ITC data, but just an overview, it's a longitudinal survey that began in 2002, like I said, but you have follow-up surveys that replenish respondents that are lost due to attrition. So I think data collection was using telephone up until 2007, which was, I think, wave 6. And by 2007, 2008, they moved to online survey. But several studies, like I said, have done it. So full details are available everywhere. So we limited our countries to Canada and the United States. for our treatment and our control country. And we looked at only adults aged 18 years and older. That's what the survey actually is. 18 years and older who smoked more than 100 cigarettes in their life. So established smokers and had smoked at least one time in the past 30 days. So a little bit about our measures. We had two primary outcomes. The first was what we call the Label Impact Index. And it's a weighted measure of three different things, which have questions for the three of them. So one is the warning label salience, and the reasoning behind that is to figure out how many people have noticed the warnings, look closely at those warnings. Have you seen the cigarette warnings? So that was one thing to look at. Then we also looked at behavioral reactions, which is after seeing these warnings, how many times has it made you think about quitting? Has it made you, just consider exactly what you're doing? And cognitive reactions are also similar. Have you had to sit down and think about the health risks of smoking just by looking at the labels? Has it made you think about has it increased your risk perception more or less? So sometime it started in 2009, weighted these measures and came up with what's called the Label Impact Index, and it has been used in several other studies. But overall, it's a continuous measure. So the higher your scores, the greater the impact of the label on these three different aspects. And the second outcome was intention to quit smoking. So that was a simple question. Do you plan to quit smoking? And there were four options: in the next month, in the next 6 months, sometime in the future. And all those we coded as one. And if you didn't fall into either that was otherwise. So these were our two primary outcomes for this study. Well, policy exposure variable, it was an interaction, because this was a difference in different study. And it was an interaction of two variables. One, the country variable, and also the timing, so pre-post policy variable. So the country variable is an indicator of where you're living. So this table just shows how we defined it. So if you're living in Canada, you will be assigned a 1 for your country variable. If you're living in the United States, you will be assigned a 0 for your country variable. For the pre-post policy variable, all the time before March 2012, which was when the policy went into place, we were assigned 0 across both times, across both countries. And any time after March 2012, including March 2012, you'll be assigned a 1 for Canada, because that's where the treatment was, and that's when the treatment took place, and a 0 for United States. So when you do that, you see this is how it comes to: before, Canada and the United States were both 0s, and after, Canada was a 1, while the United States remained a 0. Now, because we were doing a 3-way interaction, we had third difference variables. Now we're going to look at how the differences in those countries were actually still different by sex. And this was male, female. We also looked at it by education. We defined low, medium, and high. And we also had a category not stated. And then annual household income, low, medium, and high, also had a category not stated. Then, of course, we had our control variables, which included third difference variables, but we controlled for several other things like the age group. We had ethnicity, we had smoking status, we had the use of vaping products. Quit intentions were included only in the LII model. We also controlled for time, but the survey waves. Then we had a control variable called time in sample, which controlled for how many times you've been in that study. So just to control for the familiarity you might have with the questions. Then we control for the survey mode, and of course the cigarette price per daily dose, because we know that cigarette prices definitely do influence some of these variables like quit intentions. So we had 4 different types of analysis that we conducted. The first was an unweighted sample distribution. So we just looked at the distribution of the sample variables across the 2 countries, Canada and the United States. Then another analysis we did was to actually look at the trend of the LII scores and the quit intention prevalence by wave across time. So we did that for the 2 countries. Then we came to the main model which was our difference in difference is what I'm going to call it, but it was actually a controlled interrupted time series model, which is an extension of the difference in difference. Well, while I'm here, maybe I should talk a little bit about that. So the difference in difference analysis will have allowed us to compare Canada with the United States at two different times, which will have been that 2012. But because Canada had a graphic warning label policy in 2000, between 2000 and 2012, the trend in Canada was very different for that one in the United States because they did not have that kind of policy. So what we call the parallel trend assumption, difference in difference, might not have applied. So in order to do that, we have what we call an emerge of difference in difference and interrupted time series, which is called the controlled interrupted time series. So with that, we're able to control for time in a difference in difference model. And so that's why we called it this. So our first model was to look at the two-way interaction between country and time using the regression model. And then after that, we had another model that looked at the three-way interaction between country, time, and our third difference variables. So this just shows you what I explained in the policy measure. Two-way interaction, the main variable we're looking at is country and policy. But when it comes to the three-way interaction, we're interacting that with sex and just replicating this thing for education and for income. So I'll just take a break here.
Thank you, Buki. So let's turn to our discussant today, Justin White, to see whether he has any comments. But we would also like to hear from audience. So please put your questions in Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So maybe a good place to start would just be related to the background. And I'm curious if you'd say anything more about what's sort of the evidence base for the effectiveness of graphic warning labels overall. I mean, you talked a little bit about how there's not much evidence by subgroup, but how would you sort of characterize the overall evidence on the effectiveness, just for our audience members who might not be familiar?
Okay, so thank you for that question, Justin. You're right, I did say that briefly. Overall, evidence has shown that graphic warning labels have great benefits, and specifically for smoking prevalence, lower smoking prevalence, and when it comes to the salience of the label, so things that are related to you looking at it and then thinking about why you're doing, increasing risk perception and thinking more about quitting, maybe not necessarily quit success or quit intentions, but overall it's beneficial. Even with the mixed evidence we have by sex and socioeconomic status, more evidence links to the fact that either way it's still beneficial in closing gaps in one way or the other. So it's all around two-way, three-way. It's a very great policy to consider when we're looking at tobacco-related outcomes.
So one thing that I think is a bit distinctive about your study is that it's looking at the Canadian context, going from having a graphic warning label to a stronger one. And so it's my understanding that like one of the big changes, which I think you mentioned, is going from, having it on 50% of the front and back of the packet versus the new law being 75%. And so in some ways, this feels like it's a pretty strong test of the effect of graphic warning labels. Because I would imagine that like the strongest changes would be going from, say, no graphic warning label to having one. Do you think that's sort of a fair characterization, that this is sort of like a pretty strong test of it, or?
Yeah. It's another thing we considered. You're very right, because we considered, should we look at the change versus no change? But so instead of looking at that change, which is a very strong test, like you said, versus text, why not look at that strong change versus someone who did not change? But because it's a difference in difference, we have to be careful about the population groups that we're comparing. In Canada, United States was just the closest population group to compare to Canada. And so we decided to just stick with that text only. Well, it's a much stronger test to have looked at. Before this, we did have the study that looked at the 2000 actually, that looked at that first change versus text only. So that one is also available, that's been published. So yeah, I do agree with you, that's a strong thing. I'm going to say something about the evidence though. The evidence that, most of the evidence that has looked at that change in policy have mostly been experimental studies. So giving people stronger labels to see how does that impact you. We've had observational studies, but most of them were experimental studies, which is why we thought it was good to test this observationally and quasi-experimentally, more or less.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier that your hypothesis is that lower socioeconomic status groups might be more affected by this stronger regulation. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about why that was a hypothesis. Was it because those groups might be like less aware of the health risks, or sort of what was driving, what was behind that hypothesis, the mechanisms that you were thinking about?
So it was the evidence that was existing, even though it was mixed. Like I said, a lot of the evidence kind of was tilted towards the fact that it's benefited lower socioeconomic groups more than higher socioeconomic groups. So that informed a lot of the hypothesis. But when you also, I think that was kind of the major thing that informed why we said this is what we expect to see, because the evidence is mixed, but greater evidence suggests that lower income people really think about these things once they see the labels, or people that are in low income groups, really think about these things when they see the labels compared to people in higher socioeconomic groups. So the evidence just kind of informed our evidence, really.
Great. And so the outcomes that you chose, they tend to be, they're a bit more cognitive than behavioral. So you're not looking at changes in smoking status or whatever intensity of cigarette use. And I'm curious about sort of, was that because those were thought to be sort of like more direct effects, or what was sort of the thought process behind that?
So two things about that was the one we did with the 2000 policy in Canada, the difference looked at smoking rates. That one looked at smoking rates. But the thing is that the data was different, it was a cross-sectional survey. So we were able to get prevalence data. Getting prevalence data from ITC is not ideal. So it would have been also good to look at the prevalence and the smoking prevalence, but we're using a longitudinal survey. So they're all smokers. So it was not going to give us a true picture of what we wanted to see. And then the second thing is what we mentioned, these are direct effects of the labels. So things like looking at the labels, did you notice it? Things like, did it make you think about quitting? Things like, did it make you think about your risks for smoking? So we also wanted to do something different from what we did in the 2000 paper, which is look at the label, direct effects of the label, not just smoking rates, because most of the evidence that's there actually suggests that's the best way to test the policy,
Yeah.
So
I think if I could ask about confounding as it might relate to this study. So quit intentions in particular, I think, there could be a lot of other factors aside from this graphic warning label change that could affect that. And I see one of the questions in the Q&A by Norbert Schmidt is talking about the influence of taxes. You can think of all sorts of other policy variables. I believe that flavored cigarettes were banned around a similar time in Canada. And I'm curious, whether you think that how concerned we should be about confounding bias here.
So the major confounding bias is what you mentioned, the cigarette taxes, and we controlled for cigarette price actually, which we believed was much more per dose. So that's for an individual level, which we believed which will be a better representation of the impact on that individual. But it's a difference in difference. So in terms of the other policies that are implemented in the country, that's why we control for time, because we wanted the model to differentiate that it's not the parallel trend assumption might not work in this particular study, because Canada had a series of other things going on during that time. For example, in 2000, they had their new policy. So by 2002, there was a decline in many things or an increase in many things compared to the United States. So we created this group variable that's like an interaction between country and time, which is I think you'll see that somewhere here. Country and time, so that it's able to control in the different countries the trends that might be taking place within that time. So that's what we did to take that into account, to be able to increase the confidence we had in the results that we found.
Great. So I think I'll just make one more comment about this, and then I'll turn it over to C. I think this is sort of interesting. It seems like time here, wave is probably, you're specifying it as a continuous variable, whereas, and so then you do have that wave country interaction, which is adjusting for allowing for like a differential trend, a different trend in Canada versus the US as relates to time. Economists would typically use, within a difference in differences model, a little slightly more flexible model that would have wave fixed effects. So like a dummy variable for each wave, which would allow for the effects to differ period by period. So it is a slightly different setup from the one you have. And I don't have a question about it, but just sort of raising that sort of difference as it.
But I'd like to say something about that. We did do that. We did test that. We did like several sensitivity analysis, and there was really no difference when we did it as a dummy variable versus putting it as a continuous time frame. So just to add to what you said, we tried it.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. C, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you. So there is a question from Reginald Herbert asking, do you see any evidence of declining effect from the initial labeling rollout? If so, how does this change compare to that initial effect? So do you see like a effect changing over time?
Yeah. So I said when they instituted in 2000, by 2009, they started seeing a great decline in some of these outcomes, which is where studies show that the effect of these graphic warning labels actually do wane over time. So that's in strengthen the call for strengthening or revising the policies or revising these labels, because people tend to get used to it, or they tend to not remember if they saw it any longer. So yeah, we did see that effect. But in terms of the difference between the effects at the two time periods, we did not test that. So I don't know, what the difference would have been at 2012, that change versus the 2012 and 2000. From what I remember, I will think that the change in the 2000 was greater, because evidence shows that change from black and white to colored really has a lot of jump in different kind of outcomes compared to changing from color to another color, but just the bigger one. Except you're going from color to standardized or plain packaging. I presume that black and white to colored will have caused a greater change compared to the newer policy.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I would hypothesize that similar way as well. So I don't see any other audience questions. So please continue. Thank you, Buki.
Okay, all right. So now let me go to my next slide. Now we'll look at the results. Okay. So here, this is just the first sample distribution across in the two different countries in Canada and United States. As you can see, the ends were pretty similar, not too far from each other. But what I want us to notice was that the distribution by sex and age specifically were pretty similar. It was across the two different countries. It wasn't that different. Same for ethnicity. They were mostly white in Canada and also in the US. Similarly, also when it comes to income and education, we had higher distribution in low and medium as compared to high when you combine the low and the medium. So the distribution was pretty similar across the two different countries, and we definitely had a lot more daily smokers than non-daily smokers. So that's something that we observed when it came to the distribution in the two different countries. Now let's look at the second analysis, which was when we modeled the trend across time, and you also speak to some of the things I was saying about the waning effect of the graphic warning labels. So what you'll observe was that in this is for the label impact index cost trend, and we have the years, the waves. They're a bit twatted, I apologize for that. We have the waves here, and then we have the scores here. And the label impact index, like I mentioned, the greater the scores, the higher the impact of the label warning policy. So Canada is on the gray line, The X's represent the ways, and this dotted line here just speaks to the policy, the time that the policy took effect, the policy change took effect, was announced, which was between waves 9 and the next wave. So you'll observe that from 2003, the scores were much greater in Canada versus the United States, which of course was not long after the 2000 label, graphic 1 label was introduced. But you observe that the decline started going down really fast up until 2010. It was also going down in the United States, but not as fast as it went down in Canada, which is why some of the studies show that the effect is waning. But then you see that in 2000 and right after the policy implementation, there was a jump in effectiveness. Why we didn't observe that, let me put that, yeah. Why we did not observe that in the United States, but after the policy change in Canada, its effectiveness went up, and you can see it kind of went down a little bit and started to stabilize over time. But there was also an increase in Canada, which in the United States, which it could be several things going on, but we're able to control for time trends in the two countries. So we're hoping that took care of the different assumptions that people might have. The other one we looked at was the quit intention prevalence. Also, you see that after the 2000 policy, so from 2002, quit intentions were all across the board in Canada higher than the United States. But the decline again, you observe after like 2 waves going down until the policy was implemented here. And then you see that jump right here in Canada. In the United States, after the policy was the reverse, you saw a drop in prevalence. There was this high increase there, which we couldn't figure out what was going on because several things were going on. We had the TIPS campaign, we had several things going on. It could have been any of that. But what we focused on was after the policy. There's an increase in Canada, and there was a drop in the United States for quit intention prevalence. Now, when we look at our main models, so what we see here is that this is the model for the label impact index, and you can see that, you can see that Canadians, there was a statistically significant increase in the mean scores in Canada. It was positive, 0.84, after the policy change compared to the United States, compared to the difference before the policy was implemented. So that's the difference in difference. So that difference between the two countries after was greater than the difference between the two countries before the policy. But also we did it by sex, by education, and by income. And you'll observe that for sex, the interaction, the three-way interaction was not, so this is what we're looking at here. The three-way interaction was not significant. For education, it wasn't. But for income, you'll observe that that policy change, that policy difference, so that difference we saw between Canada and the United States was greater among individuals in the low income group. And our reference group here were those in the high income group. So that speaks to what we concluded at the end of the study. If we look at the other one also, which is the quit intention model, you'd see also that Canadians had higher odds of quit intentions after the policy change compared to before the policy change, by 1.89. And we'll see that that difference between Canada and the United States was greater for participants that had high school degree or less compared to those with what we call the higher education. So that's you have a bachelor's degree or more. So that was what we observed in the two-way interaction model and the three-way interaction model for our two countries and our two models. So overall, we were able to conclude that there was a significantly greater impact in noticing warning labels, thinking about quitting, thinking about the risks of smoking, foregoing a cigarette, which are all the measures that were incorporated into the label impact index. So there was a significantly greater impact in these measures, and also in quit intentions among adults who smoked in Canada after the policy change when compared to the United States before the policy change. We found no difference in that impact by sex in either of the primary outcomes, but because of what we found that the
Thank you so much, Buki. Great presentation. Let's turn to Justin to see whether he has any comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for a really great talk. Maybe one background detail about how the measures. Can you talk about how you defined low, medium, and high categories for education and income?
Yeah,
I think you might have actually shown the education ones in sort of your table, but I'd be curious about if you could just clarify that as well as for income.
Yeah, so I should have said that. For income, it was low education, rather, was if you have a high school degree or lower, that was low education. Then medium education was those that had like some kind of college or associate degree or something like that. And then higher education was if you had a bachelor's degree or higher. Then I think for income, low income was you could earn like 50,000 or less. And this was based on the different countries' dollars. So it's not like it's 50,000 or less for low income. And then medium was like 50 to 100. And then high income was 100 or higher. 50 to something. I have to look at that.
And so C had a question that she put in the chat for everyone, that how comparable they are across countries. Do you feel like adjusting for the difference between Canadian and US dollars sort of accounts for those differences? We did adjust. We adjusted for inflation. We adjusted for in the dollars. So we did take that into account, that it's for different countries, and we modeled it in that way.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I just want to clarify my question. So I guess I was thinking that this may be related to the background. So we all know that there is smoking disparity by socioeconomic status here in the US. I'm just wondering that whether this is also observed in Canada, and if so, whether this is more, I guess disparity is more or less prevalent compared to the US context. That's also my question. Thank you.
Sorry, C, can you say that question again? I'm sorry.
So the disparity, smoking disparity by socioeconomic status, including education and income, has been well documented in the US. I'm just wondering if the Canada has a similar situation in terms of the disparity by socioeconomic status? Is it also observed in Canada? I think it's because my limited knowledge about the smoking disparity issues in Canada. So I'm just wondering if what we're observing in the US is also observed in Canada.
The short answer is yes.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
thank you.
so yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same thing they have in Canada, which is actually low income people are more likely to, you know, individuals from lower income groups, less educated groups are more likely to smoke and less likely to quit and less likely to make attempts to quit. It's the same thing we see in the US that's been documented in Canada. There's really no difference. The only difference will have been by race ethnicity, which we did not do because there are major differences by country when it comes to race ethnicity. So we did not consider that in the model.
And so thinking about your main results, there were some differences in statistical significance across the different primary outcomes. So, you know, education was more affected, I think, by in the quit intention model, and low income in the label impact index. And so do you see those as being sort of discordant findings, that sort of like it wasn't the same group consistently affected by both, or do you think that's sort of reconcilable?
Okay, so you're saying this found, we found income here, and then this was
In
just
education here, yeah.
So sorry, what's the question again? Is it?
Just the fact that different subgroups seem to be more affected by for the different outcomes, and so do you think that those are sort of is there like a story you can tell about why one group might be affected by one outcome, one by the other, or do you think that this is sort of in conflict with each other?
I don't have anything as to why they were impacted differently, which is kind of which we just decided to look at it like a socioeconomic group, even though we divided it in the model. But in terms of income and education, there might be differences. Canada and the US, I'm not sure. I know in the UK, it's a big deal because it's white collar versus blue collar. So education means a lot, but I don't know if, what I mean means a lot. I mean, they have different explanations that function, how they've categorized their variables. But for what we did, we were just looking at socioeconomic status as a whole, but we decided to split it. But I don't really know why it might have impacted education for quit intention and not income. And then labor impact index for income and not education. But that's a great research question, but I don't know why that might have happened.
Yeah. Leave that for further research.
Yeah.
So if I could ask a little bit more about the label impact index. So my understanding, and as you described it, it's this sort of like weighted sum of a few different components that you talked about earlier. In terms of how you assigned weights, like I saw in the paper that you sort of assigned your own sort of like weighting to each of the different components. I you know, Ron Borland in a prior paper had used factor analysis, I think, and I'm curious about how you decided on the assignment of weights, and whether you tried like different versions of it or that sort of thing.
We did try different versions, but one thing was constant across the different studies that you mentioned. Salience was always weighted the least, and then cognitive was next, and then behavioral was next, which is what we also applied to this particular measure. But, and so salience, we had a 1 harm, 2 quitting, and 2 and just for going through. So we followed that same model. And I think even though he used factor analysis, it's kind of similar to what we did in terms of what particular variable had more weight versus another particular variable. So it wasn't that different, but regardless of how many things we tried, we made sure that salience was lower, and then cognitive, and then behavioral. So it was, that was pretty constant through.
And did you, I guess, also disaggregate that index to look at the effects on the individual components? I'd be curious to see like whether, you know, one of them was more, you know, salience was more or less affected. Or...
That's a great question. I think we did. I don't remember anything now because that was at the beginning of the study. We tried to look at the different things, but I'm not even sure what we found out because we started working with this weighted measure almost immediately after. But I think we did.
Okay.
I'm not sure what we did, but I'll say though that from what I know, salience seems to be one that it always speaks out to because it's speaking directly to, did you notice this? You know?
Yeah.
But in terms of what we want to see in the tobacco control space, we want to see its impact on you thinking about quitting, on you thinking about increasing your risk perception. So I can't remember what we saw differentially, but we did test that, those differences.
So if we take your findings that certain low SES subgroups are more affected, do you follow from that? Do you conclude that, like, should we be tailoring graphic warning label messages and images to certain subgroups, or should that affect how these messages are being designed?
It's a good question, but since we found now that it has a potentially positive equity impact, so it means that as it is right now, probably, this is another research question, should we revise it every 5 years so we can keep closing that gap? Because this is one study that showed there was an equity impact, but that was after 10 years, or after 12 years rather. So maybe if we should we do it every 2 years? Should we do it every 5 years? Should we do it every, that's something to also look at to see how quickly can we use this policy method and what other forms of revision cannot look, cannot become familiar. So what can we do? How frequently should we do it? What else can we, what other kind of revision? Like, it would be good to see what impact adding the quit toll line, quit number on the cigarette package. That was a good thing. But our study wasn't able to tease out that impact. So it'd be good to see what if we just do that? What if we just do this? But overall, the whole provisions that's related to graphic warning labels do have an equity impact from what we can see. So it's just to figure out, do we do it more often? What are the separate provisions that we can do to just make it look different? So not necessarily doing anything so different for a group versus another group, because it's already working.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So maybe last issue, and then I'll turn it back to the moderator. So I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Canada adopted a plain packaging law in 2020. And so I guess I have two questions related to that. So one is just, was that implemented before the 2020 wave of the ITC survey took place, in which case it might be another one of these sort of time varying confounders? And then the second one is sort of how you think about that. Like, does that interact with graphic warning labels? Is that going to affect both your outcomes that you measured here, as well as behavioral outcomes in terms of either, whatever, increasing or diminishing the overall sort of interaction effect of these two policies together?
So to the first question, it was before, because the 2020 wave was 2019 to 2020, but I have to check again. I don't know if you remember when exactly it was implemented. I don't know if it went into effect. Right. Yeah, so that's a good question. I presume that since it was announced in 2020, maybe it went into effect in 2021. I don't know. But I don't see it having an impact on our study, because generally policy changes take about 2 years for you to see, for people to like observe and for you to see something. So even if it went into effect in 2020, that was the final year of our study. I'm not sure it will have impacted people's responses that much to impact the results that we found. And the second part of your question, can you just repeat that, please?
Yeah, I was just wondering how you think plain packaging plus graphic warning labels might, what the interaction effect of those two policies together might be, as it relates to either your outcomes that you looked at in this study, or more generally, sort of like, what if you have thoughts about that?
I think interaction of those two will definitely have a greater impact. So if, for example, that was implemented in 2019, then that will have really scaled what we found, because plain packaging is very different from graphic warning labels. So it's like I was explaining to see, going from black and white to graphic warning labels, you should see like a huge difference in responses. Similarly, I believe going from graphic warning labels to no plain packaging, you should see. So that interaction will have definitely impacted what we found if it really happened like 2019, for example, or 2018. So, but like I said, I don't think it affected the study, because even if it was announced in 2020, it might take 2 years for you to really see anything happen among the population.
Great. Those are all
Thank
my
you.
questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you both. So we have some audience questions. Christian Science asking, is there any research on the effect of tax increases on cigarettes on the same index that you are using as your outcome variable? That way we can understand the magnitude of these effects relative to just the taxing cigarettes. Have a think about the, I believe the outcome Christian is asking about is this index, yeah.
We did not, and probably because of this differences, this nuances of tax increases versus just the taxing on cigarettes, we just decided to go with what the person is actually paying for the cigarettes. So we did look at those differences, and we're hoping that we'll have been able to cover this nuanced definition between tax increases and whether it was tax itself. And then the other question, did you ask another question? I'm sorry.
I think these are related. Yes, I think you answered those questions. The first part is about the outcome variable, whether you tested that, and understanding the magnitude relative to taxing in cigarettes. So I think these are one question related.
Okay.
But I think my understanding is this is going to be another interesting future topic to explore. So we also have a question from Francis Thompson, and asking the contraband. So a reasonable proportion of contraband cigarettes sold in Canada have either no warnings or US warnings. So, and buying contraband is correlated with lower socioeconomic status. Did you look at whether this effect is significant enough to have a measurable impact? Presumably we're biased towards finding less impact from graphic warning labels. So the influence of contrabands.
Yeah, we did not, because I believe that to do that, you have to possibly ask where they got their cigarettes from. I don't know. But we did not do that. I don't know if the ITC data had that. So I can't speak to what impact that would have had on the differences we saw by socioeconomic status. But I mean, that's a good thing to think about. But we did look at that effect on buying contraband cigarettes. I really don't know how impactful that would have been, though, but we didn't anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely very challenging to study. And Francis also shared some information about the deadline for manufacturers to comply with plain packaging. The deadline was November 2019. So thank you very much for that information.
Oh, great.
Let me see. I think those are all the questions I see from the Q&A. And thank you so much, Buki, for the great presentation. I'll turn this to Max to conclude today's helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
We are out of time. Thank you to our presenter, moderator, and discussant. Finally, thank you to the audience of 140 people for your participation. Have a top-notch weekend.